rather negative effects on the local peace processes that we were seeing coming into being, and their dynamism and diversity and so on. So it does seem, looking back with a longer view, that for all of its weaknesses, that liberal platform for peacemaking did allow a lot of progress. But it wasn't able to maintain itself, and the health of every international order requires on tools for its improvement in order to maintain its legitimacy. And legitimacy means that political claims have to be addressed, and we weren't seeing that after a period of time. So there's something about the liberal international order which allowed an expansion of thinking about peacemaking, and participants in peacemaking, allowed us to dig down much further than we ever had done before, and also to expand the international order concerned with peacemaking. But there's also something about it which just ended up with very lengthy peace processes, such as in Cyprus and in Colombia, which wax and wane and are, I suppose, in the long term, really just stuck, as Roger pointed out. So I think, my sort of own research interests are now on this question of, how do we break that stalemate? How do we get beyond those blockages? How do we innovate? And that's why I found the kind of local turn hybridity debate so exciting, because they seem to be innovative. They seem to be taking the debate forwards. And also they were self-aware. I mean, they were engaging with local political claims in ways that we had never done before. But they were also aware of their own methodological and ethical failings. So there were some good things about that whole debate. It seems to me that it's sort of dying off a little bit, faith in the liberal international order. And I know, from discussions I have with colleagues around the world, that it's having a very direct impact on civil society work and movements and on local peacemaking. It's creating new enclosures for local peacemaking, and it's turning institutionalized methods associated with the liberal international order into kind of moribund artifacts of a past era. So I think, for me, this is a research agenda that I've become really quite interested in recently.
I think it's worth saying that a focus on the local is not inherently critical. It is possible to look at the local and through a conservative lens. And actually what we see is, in many cases, a patronizing of the local, or else a very shallow engagement with the local. We've seen, in a sense, local washing, or the capture of the local for declaratory purposes or symbolic purposes, and we've seen international organizations use phrases like local participation, local ownership, like confetti. So it's worth noting that there isn't an equivalence, an automatic equivalence between the local and the critical. I think in a sense, I agree with Oliver. I think that a lot of the critical work has lost its way somewhat. Part of this, I think, is because the field has grown so large. Part of this, I think, is because there are incentives to work on projects, on empirical projects, on evaluation, on describing projects, rather than more conceptual work that can be critical, that can unpack the meaning and practice of key terms. And I think that there's a danger that the critical literature becomes self-enclosed. Oliver used the very useful term enclosure. It becomes this self-contained epistemological circle or loop in which the epistemological community becomes exclusive. And what we see is the critique of the critique, and the critique of the critique of the critique, and the critique of the critique, you get the point. And not a serious engagement of those that wield power. And after all, it's worth thinking, or it's worth remembering, that for me, the single defining differential between the problem-solving approach and the critical approach is that the critical approach is interested in power. Who has it? Why do they have it? And is there a possibility of taking some of that power from them? Largely, I find that the problem-solving approach is not very curious about who has power and the future direction of power. So I think there's plenty of room for a critical agenda conceptually, but actually the space for true engagement with those who hold power, I think, is probably has not expanded. And added to the mix, we really have seen a retreat from peace towards security and stabilization. We see major organizations, whether the UN, the European Union, and many others, withdrawing from the language of peace, not using terms like peace building or peace anymore, and instead using terms like stabilization or meaningless terms like engaging with stakeholders, rather than actually being quite declaratory and being normative and using the term peace. So I think, just to finish optimistically, I think there's an enormous opportunity. There still remains an enormous opportunity for critical scholars and for critical practitioners.
Thank you, Roger and Oliver, for this first approach to the critical discussions in peace building, in peace studies, the pitfalls, and some of its relationship with the liberal peace. I would like to open perhaps for some questions, just before we continue with another set of questions that we have. So if people feel comfortable asking in English, please do it. If not, we can help you translate. I mean, if not, you can ask in Spanish and we translate. We have some here in the chat.
Do you hear?
Yes. Let me, Eduardo or? Okay.
Can I respond to Eduardo's question, please?
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yes, my question is about the role of churches and religion in peace building. What do you think is diminishing in the last 10 years, in the last years, or how is your experience in especially regarding everyday life peace indicators?
I would like to add that Eduardo is in Venezuela at this moment, in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, and he works with migrants. So just to give that context.
Important work. I think it's very difficult to generalize, to give a generalized answer, because I think religion is more important in some places than others. But let me say this, and that is, I think the westernized peace-building sector has great difficulty with religion. It doesn't get the immaterial and spiritual lives that many people on the planet have. And therefore, in its attempt to understand religion, it sees it as just another part of civil society. And I think that's a mistake. And thus it uses terms like faith-based organization. I don't know anyone who worships, whether they worship on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday, who says to their family, okay, let's get in the car, we're all going to the faith-based organization. I think it's a wonderful example of how, in a sense, out of touch a lot of formal peace building is, and how it has difficulty grappling with ways of thinking that do not conform to log frames and very formal attempts to standardize approaches to peace. Certainly in everyday peace indicators, some communities see religion and spirituality as a fundamental way of understanding peace, and other societies do not. Hence my response that it's very difficult to generalize. But I think, you know, my main point is that it's very difficult for organizations that do not come from a religious tradition to understand the power and the meaning of religion.
I don't know, Oliver, you would like to add something, or we go with continue with the next question?
Let's continue with the next question.
Okay. So I am curious how you, as in your experience as a researcher, and what are the problems, the obstacles, the pitfalls that you found when engaging with the local? And of course, this is, I mean, you are scholars from the global north, so how this interaction has been, how do you work in this setting as researchers?
Say a few words.
Let me tell a story if I can, and it ends with a rude word, so forgive me, Father Eduardo, and if anyone else is offended, please mute for the next few minutes. So when we started Everyday Peace Indicators, we were working in northern Uganda, and in order to get there, we needed a 4x4, and it was a full day journey. And the road stopped about 20 miles north of Kampala. And it was a very bumpy journey. And then we had to stay overnight in a town in Gulu, and then travel quite a bit further to find a village where we had identified by satellite the settlements, and we were going to do a survey in every third hut. And I was with a local translator from our partner organization in Uganda, and we went to the hut, and Evelyn, my colleague, knocked on the lintel of the door to see who was in so that she could ask them questions as part of our survey. So she knocked on the lintel of the door, and a young man in an Arsenal football top came out, and Evelyn explained in the local language what we were doing and what we wanted. And the young man said something and walked off. And I said to Evelyn, what did he say? And she said, he told you to fuck off. And it was a wonderful lesson in the need for humility, in the need to respect, and that the local is under absolutely no obligation to talk with us. So in my research, particularly with Everyday Peace Indicators and with the Getting On With It project, we try to be conflict sensitive. We work with local organizations. I'm very aware that I am a white guy from the global north, and I'm quite skeptical of research that claims to be experiential, because I'm extremely privileged. I have a visa in two senses of the word. One, a visa card to buy myself into a nice hotel. And secondly, a visa to get in and out of the country. So I think research with the local is actually best done, research on the local is best done with the local. It's best done with a good deal of humility. And it's best done with an understanding that outsiders very rarely can understand the entire context. Different social conditions and relations have a different meaning in different places, and it's very difficult for an outsider to understand that. You know, an outside lens can be useful, but very often it does not get the full picture. So I think my overarching approach is one of not knowing and humility, and a sense that I'm never going to know everything. So it's what we've called a good enough methodology, rather than perpetuating the conceit of a perfect methodology.
Thank you. Humility, good enough methodology, and listening. Oliver.
So, I mean, my approach is a little bit different in the sense that I came to some of this work through institutional ethnographic methods, which we're developing in kind of post-development studies and so on a while ago. And I think it's always been rather difficult to imagine with any sincerity that someone like myself could, gain some kind of access which would be earth-shattering and significant on my own grounds. And this connects to the previous question, which I didn't address, which Roger talks about a bit, about the kind of difference between critical and problem-solving methodologies. The international peace architecture that we currently have, limited as it is and problematic as it is in so many ways and weak and so on, has allowed for a lot of, let's say, transnational, transscalar and transversal movement. And I don't think we've really seen anything like this before. So in these institutions, from civil society organizations, from CSOs and local NGOs, all the way through to the donors and the international organizations and beyond, and despite all of their constraints, there has been much more of what I'm thinking of as a polylogue going on about the sorts of political claims and the differences that emerge when those political claims meet around the world. And early shorthand for this was internationalism, was that we would construct an international which was inclusive of representatives from all over the world, which proscribed violence and which enabled communication and could lead to new policy which would deal with local political claims and establish checks and balances at the state level and build an international system that could emancipate in material and representative and justice terms. So we're not really saying anything new here at this point. What we're really saying is that that hasn't worked out as we expected. Many conflicts groups and peoples have been deadlocked and fallen off the map. The institutions don't work, the checks and balances are being disputed or are being unraveled as we speak, even in the global north. But still, the possibility of that kind of institutional ethnography allows you to see and connect with discussions and debate and engage with ideas, claims, questions of justice. I mean, the sorts of questions that arise in a critical perspective, but tend to be pushed out of a problem-solving perspective, where there is a project with a set time frame which has to be achieved. So I think it was the beginnings of a global critical debate in institutions which were connected with power, which were more representative than we'd ever seen before, but of course not fully representative, and were still heavily constrained by their founding structures, i.e. the UN system in 1945, this kind of thing. So for me, that's been the place where I found insights and debates going on, which puts distant political claims distant to my own kind of methodological standing into a space where they could interact with institutional thinking, with the design of the modern state, with the tools that were emerging and being used, from peacekeeping through to donor support for civil society organizations and all the stuff that was happening around that. And it was, very interesting to identify and to observe the kind of power relations that operated in that institutional framework for ethnographic rendering of peace, which suggested as Roger mentioned earlier, a lot of cooptation, some rejection of claims that were being brought to formal tables at the international level, and the overbearing weight of the ideological preoccupations of Western actors and the security preoccupations of the main geopolitical players in the system. So we can identify that now, and we can see that this has clearly been a problem. And I think it's given us a sense of what needs to be done in the next round, the new generation of scholars who come through to study peace, those who focus on institutions, those who focus on developments, those who focus on security, need to engage with this. So as Roger says, there's a huge amount of traction here where we can offer these sorts of insights. And I still think that if we don't have some modernized and revised form of internationalism, of emancipatory and critical thought in those new frameworks that are emerging, and in particular when we're talking about multipolarity. Multipolarity has zero peacemaking tools. It's even worse than the liberal international order, I think, apart from kind of basic balance of power stuff and maybe high-level diplomacy, congressing and conferencing. So there's a lot of traction, a lot of space there. I think we've been taking a breath for a while, gathering data, and now we need a more comprehensive analysis to say what all of this local research means in political terms, what it means for order, a transcale, transversal form of order. We can see that ignoring it potentially leads to the collapse of political order, not just domestic political orders as in Colombia or in Bosnia or wherever, but at the international level, because these systems become illegitimate. So I think we're on the brink of something fresher here with these sorts of realizations, but they're not really in the literature yet. I think international actors, I was, talking to some UN people fairly recently in New York, and I was interested to see how they're dealing with this moment of uncertainty in their worldviews, where they have people around the table who are from all over the world, who can give them a slightly more local reading, but are familiar with the international and thinking behind the modern state and the global economy and rights and all these sorts of things. Some are kind of retrogressive thinkers. So for some thinkers at the international level, I think we have a sense that multipolarity is a relief, because they could never achieve any kind of real redressal of these complex local claims, they think, and therefore they can just get back to security and geopolitics. Whereas for others, I think a growing awareness of complexity means a rethinking of emancipation, a rethinking of criticality, and major reform of political, economic, and social systems. And for me, just to kind of, don't want to go on too any further, but just to kind of put this into a kind of a labeling box, I would say what we're talking about is the possibility of the convergence of peace through the insights that have arisen from its subaltern perspectives that have recently become part of the conversation, the polylogue. And so revision of the system according to those kinds of insights, or a rejection and collapse of that system, and who knows what comes next.
Thank you. Luis, you want to continue? Next question, please.
Thank you, Maria Lucia. I'm going to make the most of two comments that you've made in your different answers. Oliver, because you mentioned as part of your new methodology or your revision of the methodologies for your work, issues of identity and language, and you just mentioned emancipation also as a concept. And for you, Roger, because you mentioned the use of buzzwords in sort of the development security community regarding local participation, local ownership, the local political participation, a new term has appeared in a lot of literature that I'm revising from documents from Western donors and Western international actors: decolonization, structural racism, decoloniality, the white gaze. And it seems to me that they're starting to create their own concepts and talk about the idea of decolonizing peace work. What does that say to you? What is for you decolonizing peace studies? How do you view these new trends that are appearing in development and peace building with the term colonization, decolonization put into them? What does that say to your research? What are your concerns about those uses of those terms?
Well, anything I say must be contextualized that I'm a white middle-aged male from the global north, albeit an Irish one. Ireland tells itself that it was never, it was colonized and never was a colonizer, although many Irish people engaged in colonial projects, usually on behalf of the British. I think it is absolutely true if you look at the material power of publication, of research, of the commission and initiation of research, of funded research, then the vast majority does come from the global north. And that has had a patterning effect on what we study, how we study it, where we publish it, and the languages that we publish it in. So I think any debates that upset that disrupt the norm are good. But again, I am quite cautious. I mean, can we really foresee an African social science funder funding major research, a major research competition that would look at conflict in the Balkans? You know, in a sense, can we think of this methodological and epistemological flip, this power shift? I'm not convinced that that's on the horizon. So I think these debates are good. I think a lot of them, unfortunately, might, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, but I think that they might be engaged in virtue signaling rather than actually thinking seriously about power structures within academia and other forms of research. And also, I think that we need to think seriously not only about decolonization and recognizing the harms and the legacy of colonialism, but about diversification, about how can we diversify the academy, how can we make it less male, and I wouldn't want to say replace voices like mine, because I hope I have a little way to go, but at least add to voices like mine from others. But I have to say I'm cautious, I'm skeptical about a lot of what I'm seeing at the minute that is conducted under the banner of decolonialization. But my jury is out. I'm going to wait a little longer to see if this is meaningful.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've been working with a scholar a little bit on the question of from sub-Saharan Africa, and he's written some quite important books in the decolonial field, and we've been sparring a little bit over questions of peace in a decolonized international and what it means for peace. I mean, it's really problematic for the liberal peace, obviously, and for anything which is resting on antecedents which go back through imperialism and the global capitalist economy, and so on. But at the moment, it seems to me that what colleagues of mine who are working much more authentically on decolonized forms of peace are suggesting is valuable, but it doesn't have leverage. So to compete in a world of geopolitics with those geopolitical blocks that are emerging around the world, including the BRICS, and to foreground the political claims that are being made by the weak and the powerless and subalterns around the world who are suffering from direct and indirect forms of violence, is not going to work. And this, in a sense, pushes us, perhaps unfortunately, back to, well, what has worked? So, as I said earlier, the kind of liberal international order and liberal peace framework did allow a platform for all these research agendas to emerge and for voices to develop and for networks to be built, for civil society to expand, for donors to disperse resources. It reached its limits and lost its legitimacy. But I sort of see at the moment that all of the other blocks in this multipolar order are some way, if not extremely far, behind that. Even less prescription of violence, less redistribution, less openness, fewer platforms, and so on, in political terms, at least. So I think the decolonization project is a philosophical project, which because peace is so controversial, I mean, in the West, it seems a leftist preoccupation often, it hasn't really been subject to it. Peace was captured by socialist thinking and communist thinking to a large degree, which itself didn't want to act on these big decolonial questions. So we ended up with very anodyne forms of peace. And you can see that connection, in policy practice, in praxis, and in many problem-solving conceptual and theoretical contributions over the decades. And you can see that in practice kind of feeding its way all the way through from the kind of beginning of the 20th century to debates about the new agenda for peace now. I mean, this is supposed to be an agenda for peace, which is coming out from the Secretariat of the UN, which, as I alluded to earlier, I had some sort of engagement with there recently, which, is aware of decolonization, is aware of the environmental connections, is aware of the local turn, is aware of questions of legitimacy and those sorts of things. But the power holders in the dialogue or polylogue around the table and the documents that are emerging are intricately written. So there is a hidden hierarchy in those documents in which security and institutional concerns are still at the top, still favor the global north. And the decolonial debates, the environmental debates, the gender debates, and all those sorts of things are tick box buzzwords that are connected in the document to the power structures, which are shaping a rather conservative version of peace yet again. So it seems like we're almost repeating what happened after 1990 with the agenda for peace here. It's anodyne, is not really decolonized. It doesn't really do gender stuff. I mean, the environmental question and so on, these are big structural issues which cannot and will not be addressed. So what we're getting is the tendency to produce documents, doctrines, which will never really be implemented because the doctrines themselves speak against a system which cannot change without some radical process. And I think that, in a sense, mirrors the frustration that I have sensed in my engagement with local peacemakers, local peace builders, mediators, civil society actors all around the world since the 1990s when I was engaged in it. And, the frustrations with the stalemates it produces, with the hypocrisy, and now it's undergone this ineffable process of loss of legitimacy, which has made it completely ineffective. So, the warnings were there. Now it doesn't work at all, and it's being pushed back from many areas in the world. And I noticed in the questions, of course, there are calls for us to connect this to the Colombian context, this kind of thinking. I'm gravely concerned that the pattern of peace making, which we have applied around the world, including in Colombia, has been connected to a hegemonic order. When that hegemonic order collapses, the peace tools and systems themselves lose their capacity. So we end up with a kind of dead letter. doctrines that are not applied, stalemates that deteriorate. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give some space or read some of the questions that we have from our participants here. Okay, I'm going to start with Mariana's question. She says, considering the fact that here in Colombia there's been a conceptualized culture of violence, how would you work on changing the social ideas that have and are currently allowing armed groups, either criminal gangs or rebel groups, to see armed violence as a way of obtaining power and political objectives? So who would like to answer this one?
This is something I've struggled with, and my conclusion is that actually security approaches are required, or a level of security is required in order for pro-social and pro-peace horizontal interactions to take place, to change the culture from a culture of violence to a culture that does not prioritize violence. Now, my reticence in saying this is we all know that security approaches can involve human rights abuses, can involve, and I don't have to tell a Colombian audience, can involve situations in which police and military are out of control and not under the civil power. So security is a prerequisite for this cultural shift, for people to imitate pro-social, to see pro-social activities, and then to imitate that and to allow it to factor out horizontally. But I say that with the caveat that security obviously needs to be under a civil control and also to be time limited in many ways. So I think that is my first step in order to change the culture.
I don't know, Roger, Oliver, you would like to contribute, or should I move to the next question?
I'll just a quick comment. Drawing on the English Civil War, I mean, the Leviathan has been the traditional tool for removing violence from the informal and public sphere and concentrating it in the hands of the state. And of course, the sort of state that is produced under these conditions tends to be authoritarian and dictatorial and restarting the cycle. Now, I think a lot of the point of the work on local peacemaking and the many interdisciplinary contributions to that we can draw on, including from post-colonialism, has been putting the argument that social prescriptions of violence through social tools are first necessary. Otherwise, the state becomes a Leviathan. And I think just to try and clarify that, what we've seen over the last 30 years is we've seen an attempt by a hegemonic liberal international order to ally with sufficient liberal or social organizations on the ground and support them, that elite states and criminal power can be checked. I mean, this follows a very simple kind of Eurocentric political philosophy script, and that's broken down. But it gives us an opening to think about, well, what would replace it? How does what remains in the wreckage of this social capacity, social power for peace, international interest and tools for peace, and the checks and balances, limited as they may still be around the state, what remains, what can be augmented, and what can be added to it? Now, after World War II, the answer was the welfare states, universal education, high-level education, specialization, investment, infrastructural investment, jobs, And those sorts of, what have become rather neoliberal arguments about peacemaking, which also seem now to have reached their limits. So there needs to be an answer to the question there also of how do you produce a peace dividend to enable social prescription of violence, to filter back up, and perhaps to reformulate the way in which the states, the Janus-faced states, can be turned into a peace actor, and maybe to strengthen the international as well. I mean, at the moment, the wind is blowing in completely the opposite direction.
Thank you. I'm going to address 2 more questions, and then we can wrap up, if it's okay with you guys. So this is, this person comes from the history discipline, from history, and it's asking how to insert the concept of historicity in peace studies. It seems to me that the main approaches of peace, I guess, don't have a sense of history, as well as processes in peace building also doesn't have like a sense of history. How to solve this within the discipline? I hope I interpret well the question. Roger, would you like to in?
I published something on this in the Journal of, I think it was in Cooperation and Conflict, on the ahistoricism of peace and conflict studies, and how really we rarely look back beyond the end of the Cold War. And yet, if we think about somewhere like Colombia, it is a 200-year-old state-building project that has still to finish. So the post-Cold War frame doesn't fit. I mean, as part of the research that I'm doing at the minute, where we conduct life histories with people and daily pattern of life studies, what's very interesting is how anticipatory violence really patterns how people live in conflict-affected societies, even if they've had a major peace accord, like Colombia or Lebanon or Northern Ireland. What's interesting is how the anticipation of violence, how the thought that violence might come back, that something might happen tomorrow, is incredibly important. And what's interesting is that people are living temporally in simultaneous life worlds. They are living, obviously, in the present, but they talk and think about the future inflected by the past. So they're living in at least 3 time spheres simultaneously. And I think that that's really interesting about how individuals, families, and communities interact with a local history, interact with, oh, that area was notorious for kidnappings, or that area, you know, you would not go there at night. And that violent legacy survives, has a very curious half-life that persists, even if areas have been gentrified, even if security levels have increased. It's interesting how the phrase Beirut has become a synonym for violence and disorder, even though Beirut's and Lebanon's civil war ended many years ago. A bit like Medellin, the city of Medellin has a meaning that is probably stuck in the 1990s rather than more current. The point I'm making is that I think that individuals and families and groups, in a sense, freight or carry a lot of history with them. So in a sense, we are, if we live in a deeply divided society, we are embodiments of histories, and we make and remake it every day.
Thank you. Any response, Oliver?
Yeah, just very quickly, and another dimension of this, and I'll just kind of briefly semaphore this because I think it's complex and obscure. But my reading and to be literal about history here, my reading of the history of peacemaking is that it's always been reactive. So peace tools have been designed in conflict-affected settings after the event of a war, normally at the point when the war has become so all-consuming that there's little other choice than to make peace. And that's not really a kind of very constructive or productive way of thinking about peace in the 21st century. But one thing I will add to that is that I think if you dig a little bit deeper, you find that those tools, methods, understandings that lead to more complex ways of prescribing violence and setting up methods for peacemaking which are continuous and head into the future and provide those guarantees that societies need to prosper, come from social conversations, from these polylogues on the ground. In other words, the kind of main source of innovation hasn't been the big five around the table in 1945 and so on and so forth, but they have been drawing on this sort of multi-layered repository of historical and social knowledge about peacemaking and trying to scale it up in ways which also connect it to gigantic power structures at the international level. So all peace comes from the local in the end, and their interactions. And the way it has traveled through time has tended to be reactive. It's left sedimentary layers behind it. And unfortunately, that means, and I think this is the problem for us to address in the future, it means that all the peace tools that we currently have are really designed for the last war or the last outbreak of conflict or the last experience of violence. They don't tend to look forwards in the way that we need. They can't be applied to preempt these forms of violence, which are constantly mutating, developing, spreading, almost like a disease. I shouldn't mention COVID. So this is, I think, a problem for future generations of scholars. How do we get past this retroactive, reactive architecture of peacemaking tools? How do we also connect much more visibly and quickly the relationship between the peace noise that develops on the ground in the midst of conflict with those who have power and suddenly find they need peace tools and they need a system and they need a framework for advancement and stability to stop everything from blowing up in the long term? I think, over the 20th century, that has been speeding up, and the visibility of these social tools has been becoming greater. The gap between the development of knowledge and its adoption has become much smaller, but we haven't got to the point yet where there is full and fair and open visibility, where there is the ability to design peace tools for the future. So there's a long way to go.
Thank you. And one last question is from Laurel, that considering that you guys follow the Colombian conflict and you guys have been here also in Colombia, from a local point of view, how do you read or how do you interpret the actual context of peace conversations or peace negotiations between ELN and the national government, considering that they have, these armed groups vindicates that they have social participation and they include the local in their discourse?
I have to be very clear and say that I have no expertise whatsoever on Colombia, and I'm very conscious that the 30 or so others on the Zoom call could answer this question better than I. I would say that the Colombian peace process that led to the major peace deal between the government and the FARC was probably the last full service peace process and major peace accord that we have seen. Peace has become deeply unfashionable, and security approaches are being prioritized, and we see that in relation to whether it's Yemen or Syria or Ukraine and many other places. Therefore, for the Colombian government to and for armed groups to very consciously talk about peace, I think is significant and very important. Whether that actually leads to peace is another issue, but even using the language of peace and having a rather expansive form of engagement in terms of engaging with different groups, but also engaging on a wider set of themes, I think is important and is actually signaling to others that peace hasn't really, that there's still a place for peace in a very securitized landscape.
And, you know, just to add to that, I mean, in contexts where that hasn't happened, peace processes have become kind of empty. So you end up with these long-term stalemates where people refuse to speak to each other, where the state and certain elites work very hard on preserving their spheres of influence and excluding certain groups from conversations. And I think by very definition, to get to prescribed forms of politics where violence isn't included directly and where consensus can be built, those difficult, probably impossible conversations have to be had. What we have tended to see in the past is in these sorts of stalemate situations, the other cases that I'm alluding to where, you know, there's still violence and the talks go on, they're not inclusive, they're not pluralistic, they're certainly not post-colonial or decolonial, they're barely even equal in gender terms. And they're quite clearly about maintaining power for established elites and groups. You know, in those contexts, the processes lose legitimacy and they eventually collapse, and there's nowhere for them to go when they collapse, other than back to violence. So I don't see much alternative, but I do see a problem with the idea that a peace process has a beginning and an end. You know, part of the political technology of the 20th century was to say, no, it's not, it's institutional. That these things must continue and constantly be revisited. We still haven't really got to the point where we can do anything much more than have back channels, you know, talks which say they're not really talks, which result in agreements which often remain unimplemented, where the threat of a reversion to outright violence is always present. I mean, and that for me isn't really a peace process. And I do wonder whether we should start being a bit clearer about the terminology we're using and what its actual reality is, and have sort of higher standards. And I see Laurel's question as pointing us in both directions. I mean, there is a problem of what happens if we don't have this level of inclusion. And there is also the problem of what happens if we seem to be condoning forms of behavior which are illegal or stand against our ethics and which are themselves in some way violent. And I think that comes to the nub of why so many of those peace processes are stalemated or declining, because they have taken a superficial path in their peace processes. They built processes based on exclusion, legitimacy. They're hoping to build a Leviathan rather than the peace process.
Thank you. And now to wrap up, Luis, would you like to closing reflection, please?
Sure. No, I think based on all the discussions that we've had, it brings back some ideas from my previous research with women associations in Colombia, which kind of mentions something that talks about one of the key terms that you both write about all the time: legitimacy and peace building. These are women that work in informal transitional justice practices, doing memory, trauma healing, indigenous practices. And one of the things that they mentioned was that in areas where they're wide known to be state absence and state failure. They said, we're the only legitimate actors because we're here, we have been here, and we will always be here. And in that sense, you know, they kind of mentioned, we have something to say about legitimacy that the state and the actual current Colombian government, this was 2 years ago, cannot say. And it was really interesting for me to talk to them about how they define legitimacy. And one of the key things that they said was, actually, it's people, our neighbors, our friends, the people in our municipalities, asking for us to continue doing these sort of projects because no one else is going to do it for them. So in that sense, I think when you question all these elements of state legitimacy and the legitimacy of international actors, you know, bringing this voice of these women that do incredible projects with almost no funding in remote areas that the state doesn't arrive, that the internationals rarely arrive here in Colombia, it actually talks a lot about the real legitimacy, and it goes to everyday peace indicators. It goes to what is the local, and exactly understanding where should we go, what voices should we hear. So I think by listening to Roger and Oliver, I took notes of everything, you know, what are the best peace tools? They're located in the local. What are the best practices? Well, we need to understand, whilst not romanticizing the local, how to actually engage in these definitions. What is reconciliation? What is justice? What is truth? What is peace? And I think connecting these concerns about Colombia and our current situation regarding the total peace policy and, you know, your research agendas, your questions and your critical takes is very, very important for us as scholars, academics, practitioners here in Colombia. So I really want to thank Roger and Oliver for sharing and sharing with our students, with our undergraduates and postgraduates, you know, what it means to engage as a researcher in these issues.
Thank you, Roger, Oliver, for this enriching conversation that really, I mean, help us and illustrate and add to our discussions that we have in Colombia in peace building, peacemaking, peace processes, truth, memory, and also, so everybody, thank you for coming to this conversation on behalf of the Masters in Peace Studies and Conflict Resolution at Javeriana University in Bogota and the Week of Peace. I wish you a very good day. And for you guys, I hope you have a nice evening and enjoy the summer. Well, I know it's very hot down there, up there, but enjoy. Thank you very much for all of you and see you soon.